On August 4th, I asked a simple question. What's everyone's favorite web browser these days? What I didn't expect was how complicated your answers would be. Almost 100 responses later, I really wanted to dig into the web browsers everyone loves and loves to hate, to figure out how they got there and just how long they've been there. Why are Safari and Chrome just so dominant? When's the last time someone actually used Netscape Navigator? Where did Microsoft Edge come from? When did Opera, Vivaldi, Brave, and Arc enter the scene? And well, that's already enough to fill a wide, multi-decade time frame with characters and warning shots scattered all across the digital battlefield. Somehow, it's still not even the full picture. It doesn't include the outliers and Linux-first browsers that some of you mentioned, like Ladybird, Falcon, and Orion. Plus, there's the world on the outskirts of the Tor browser and Onion Network, those that could fill an entire anthology on their own. So, for today, let's start by peeling back the layers of the mainstream and learn about the complex and ever-combative techniques that were used to claim the throne of most used web browser throughout the history of the net. Here's an overview of all of your responses to my post. Taking a look through the numbers right off the bat, this thread made me realize that the days of Chrome's dominance were not so simple anymore, at least in the United States. Yes, this is only a small sampling, but at the very least, this shows the universe of web browsers is more diverse than it's ever been. I mean, we are about 30 years since the first browser wars that genuinely marked the start of the dot-com boom. So I think this is a good thing. We deserve diversity, and more than that, we reserve the right to experiment. It's obvious that hardware has a lifespan. Software, on the other hand, obscures its lifespan. From the ever-fluctuating paint of redesign after redesign, what was infamously a mainstream talking point in the heydays of Facebook, to the ridiculously stagnant realms of the unredesignable, like Hacker News, Reddit, and Craigslist. Without the Wayback Machine and copyright text in the footers of pages, tracing the history of software might be near impossible. That's why digital internet history is important. That's why I've been adamantly exploring it for now, the past few months on this channel. Today, we'll be focusing that lens on browsers. But if you're looking for more stories from the history of the internet, don't forget to check out the rest of my channel and subscribe for more cultural investigations, mini-docs, and more. And oh, if at any point you like what you see, feel free to pay it forward with a like and a comment down below. It sure means a lot. And without further ado, let's turn back time. In the decades following World War II, the redomestication of wartime factories meant relaunching massive industries of manufacturing. Across the world, from Rolls-Royce to Subaru, from GM, Ford to Chrysler, the lines that bolstered the powerhouses of yesterday's war were transforming into capitalist corporations of tomorrow. Engineering brilliance and efficiency could now be used to, ideally, make life better instead of ending lives forever. This was obviously a great change, but with deep infrastructure and deep pockets from the profits of war, those at the top wanted to stay at the top. Conflict had caused consolidation. It had turned hammers and nails into a civic national duty. It would take both physical and mental untangling to transition to a peaceful state that was in any way equitable. For the biggest companies, going from need to have back to the free market meant there was a whole lot to lose. A good example of big monopolistic players in the United States were, of course, the car companies. Between the 1950s and 2000s, there were countless attempts to shift the landscape of cars, famously depicted in movies like Francis Ford Coppola's Tucker, the Man in His Dream, dramatizing the downfall of the Tucker Model 48 at the hands of the major American car companies, a hand-built car that riled up an incredible amount of excitement that had been apparently considered to be a technological marvel at the time. But as had happened throughout the annals of US economic history, the bigger the companies, the easier it was to crush everyone else, even if it was just three, in this case Ford, Chevrolet, and General Motors. The iconic phrase for this intimidating group the Big Three, no doubt inspired by that same term's previous use, describing the three major Allied powers during World War II: Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But not just cars. The Big Three would be used to describe the turf war-like conquering of the preeminent profitable technologies of the time. The most widely needed or used industries would be the most sought after by hungry capitalists, from television with ABC, CBS, and NBC to record labels with Universal, Sony, and Warner Brothers. Today, perhaps the Big Three can be reintroduced in the context of modern tech. In some ways it already has, with the popular acronym FANG, or F-A-A-N-G, which describes the most mainstream tech corporations in the US, the big tech, if you will: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. In this case, though, I'm not talking about the largest tech companies in general, or even the unbelievably uneven world of smartphones, with Apple, Samsung, and Xiaomi taking the lion's share, so much so that almost every new competitor is dead on arrival. No, I'm talking about perhaps the most widely used software application in history. Yes, the good old web browser. Even in the late 90s, not too long from the launch of the world's first web browser, it was clear that the largest tech companies at that time, the Goliaths like Microsoft, were so large and influential, it would force the US to reevaluate what antitrust even meant. The high-tech world would be the new battlefield, one that wasn't simple to regulate, that wasn't as punchy as the robber barons of the centuries-old antitrust law. We were dealing with Microsoft, the symbol of American dynamism. Yeah, Microsoft in the 90s was already the largest software company in the world, who on one hand defined the era of high-tech, and on the other hand played sophomoric frat-style pranks on its arch-rival in the browser business, Netscape. Telling the story of the Big Three web browsers can feel, strangely enough, paradoxical. On one hand, there's rooms full of nerds being pushed around by bullish businessmen in suits, and on the other hand, we have billions of dollars on the line, and market share conflicts almost as messy as picking through post-war manufacturing control, if you can believe it or not. Looking at the estimates for the most popular web browsers in the United States today, we can see that recently there's statistically no competing with Apple's Safari and Google's Chrome. And as we'll see time and time again, that's directly related to Apple and Google pushing their own browsers to the forefront of their own hardware platforms, especially smartphone operating systems. Sitting at third is somehow miraculously the underdog, Microsoft Edge, the reinvention of Microsoft's now much maligned Internet Explorer franchise. Firefox barely squeaks by at the fourth place. Worldwide, Chrome swaps places with Safari, but they are both still vastly more utilized than anyone else, the single-digit percentages of Edge, Firefox, and the rest. Filtering by desktop-based users, Firefox remains at fourth, but Edge jumps to second, leaving Chrome at first and Safari at third. While that demonstrates, of course, mobile makes a very significant impact on the entire landscape. Skip back to 2010, and although the numbers look very similar, with the top dog having around 60% adoption, in second place around 20%, and the stragglers below 10%, the names are certainly not the same. At the top, Internet Explorer. Second, Firefox. Third and fourth are Chrome and Safari in a neck-and-neck race. Having been launched publicly in just 2008, Chrome's immediate rush to competing with Safari, which had been around since macOS X Panther in 2003, is definitely quite notable. So perhaps the Big Two is a better way to describe the impossible race to the top of the most used type of software in human history. Historically, in fact, has always kind of been a sympathetic outsider, a cursed third place, a backup to the viable alternative. But considering how Firefox has remained in the conversation since the early 2000s, having been first conceptualized in the year 2000 and in 2006, could even be referred to as one of the brightest stars in upcoming tech brands, according to brand channel readers, as a number 7 global brand across all segments, ahead of eBay and Sony. Well, I think it's only fair that Firefox is considered in the same race as Chrome and Safari. After all, Chrome itself was built directly from the open source codebases behind Firefox and Safari. Firefox was also, according to one of its inventors, the first browser to stem the decline of market share against Internet Explorer. And Firefox's first version had shipped over 1 million downloads on the first day alone, 10 million downloads in 10 days, and over 100 million before it was replaced by Firefox 1.5 just over a year later. And even deeper in the history books, or should I say history blogs, Mozilla was on the ground floor during the early days of web browsers, working, albeit with growing resentment on both sides, with Netscape, arguably the first of the GUI-based web browsers. It was after years of tumultuous internet startup history between now too easily forgotten juggernauts that Mozilla was forged in the first place. Mozilla finally gained the independence it had long sought, establishing a nonprofit foundation. On the same day, many of the remaining client engineers at Netscape were laid off in a mass termination. That could only have been described as a bloodbath. I mean, as much as things change, sometimes it feels like they stay the same. But let's really set the stage and go back in time, not to World War II, but to just before the Y2K era drama, to 1994, when Netscape first launched its flagship Navigator software. A bit like Mac versus Windows, Netscape Navigator hit a snag when Microsoft came in with a rival product shortly after it debuted. In this case, the arrival of Internet Explorer, just weeks after Netscape's public offering. A year later, in August '95, Netscape went public on the stock market with a valuation of a whopping $2.9 billion. In a moment of curious historical connections with that incredibly successful IPO, San Francisco investment bank Robertson Stephens agreed to underwrite an IPO for Pixar. 3 months later, in November '95, Pixar went public, turning one notable member of the Pixar leadership into a billionaire himself, a member who had been ousted from his own company in 1985 and was busy not so lucratively developing pricey black boxes at a company called Next. His name was, of course, Steve Jobs. Anyway, in retrospect, it was the start of a prolonged hot streak that made up the big third act comeback of Jobs' career. Next is itself relevant to the deep history of web browsers, as in 1996 it was behind, at the time affectionately called, Cupertino's best-kept secret: web objects. Just at the point when large corporations scrambled to get their businesses online for the first time, web objects provided the tools and technologies to create online stores in a fraction of the time that it would take with competing technologies. Dell Computer used web objects to pioneer the online retailing of PCs. Automobile manufacturers such as Nissan and Ford used it to create online catalogs of their products. And since 1997, the BBC used web objects as the technology behind its online news site. As part of his promotional efforts for the software, Steve Jobs even appeared on stage at a Microsoft Developers Conference alongside Bill Gates, professing his undying regard for Windows and Microsoft's embrace of the internet. Oh my god, how far we came. In 1996, another browser was first released to the public from its headquarters in Oslo, Norway. Opera. Sometimes described as the oldest surviving browser company, that title is mostly symptomatic of the endless acquisitions and rebranding of its competitors over the decades, but still, it's quite the accomplishment. At first, founders John Techner and Geir Iversoy built Opera from inside the research and development department at Nordic telecommunications giant Telenor, a state-operated monopoly that's been around since the mid-1800s. If you couldn't tell, Opera is wonderfully unique in the world of browsers. Some elements are familiar, like how Opera was able to remove ads due to its main financial support coming from none other than Google's default search engine arrangement, an arrangement made almost 20 years before August's ruling of antitrust practices in the realm of search engines. Other elements in Opera's past are one of a kind, like how in 2006, Opera launched on both Wii and Nintendo DS. That's right, the DS browser and Wii Internet channel were actually Opera. Features like CSS support came ahead of the curve in 1998. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is still the fundamental way websites communicate how things should look to the browser, from colors to fonts, even animations and textures. In 2001, Opera added mouse gestures. In 2009, they launched a mobile-friendly compression tool known as Opera Turbo. And in 2010, tab stacking, something iconic of outliers and newcomers that we'll cover in a little bit, like Vivaldi and Arc. In 2016, they threw in a free VPN service, and in 2018, they threw in their own crypto wallet, and to no surprise, last year, they mixed in their own AI chatbot Aria. Today, Opera is becoming increasingly well known for its widely marketed spin-off, for better or worse, Opera GX. Obviously, as a YouTuber myself, I really appreciate the widespread sponsorships of independent creators, but still, with these ads, it can get a little jargony and complicated in a maybe less than great way, as covered in this Some Ordinary Gamers video that you can check out if you want to learn more about it. So, even if Opera only accounts for less than 3% of the global browser market share, it's an inventive and in many ways admirable, long-lasting member of the browser ecosystem. It's also, interestingly enough, becoming more of a platform than a browser, based on its amalgamation of built-in components and strategies. That being said, we have to rewind back to Opera's founding and what happened 1 year later in 1997. But don't worry, in a way we'll come back to Opera later on in the video, because one of its two founders, John Chechner, the man who promised to swim the Atlantic if Opera 8 reached 1 million downloads, spoilers, it did, and he tried, he'd be responsible for another brilliant browser alternative launched in the mid-2010s that we kind of hinted at earlier. Before we get there, what else is so special about 1997? Well, in 97, 1 year after Next's WebObjects project and 2 years after Pixar made Steve Jobs a billionaire, Apple purchased Next for $427 million and subsequently reacquired Jobs after his decade-long absence. That same year, Apple controversially switched its default web browser on the Mac from Netscape to Internet Explorer. Yeah, in macOS 8.1. Of course, this was not free. Microsoft in return invested $150 million in Apple in the form of non-voting stock. Then, in 1998, AOL acquired Netscape for $4.2 billion. At the same time as that acquisition, AOL struck an alliance with Sun Microsystems, agreeing to purchase $500 million of services from Sun over the next 4 years, while Sun parted with $350 million in licensing, marketing, and advertising fees. Sun, who notably developed the Java programming language in '95, had originally made its name building workstations, and well, since the late 80s, acquiring. Funnily enough, they even grabbed some pieces of Silicon Graphics Inc., famous for the CGI workstations that were behind Toy Story, Titanic, and Jurassic Park, and also a main player in the story from my last video. Anyway, Sun had also been a partner of Steve Jobs' Next. In '93, after Next restructured to be principally a software business instead of potentially competing with the likes of Sun's workstations and Microsoft and Apple's hardware, it received $10 million from Sun's CEO Scott McNealy, which would lay the foundation for programming environments and languages, conventions, and techniques that still underpin modern software development today. These massive amounts of money were not being committed purely out of good-natured optimism and admiration. Of course not. It was always ammunition. Ammunition needed to chip away at the then unstoppable Microsoft, who tried to reframe this as a positive free market move. Specifically, while Microsoft's legal team has said the deal illustrates that competition continues to thrive in the computer industry, lead Justice Department attorney David Boies said the deal could offer further proof of Microsoft's dominance. That's why in March 1998, Netscape unveiled Mozilla, a non-profit open-source organization with a duty to disrupt Microsoft's conquest of the web browser market. Mozilla had started off as the code name for Netscape's 5.0 launch, but it pivoted as its arch-nemesis Microsoft was rapidly catching up, not only with user numbers, but also with a arguably superior technical platform for web development. In 1997, Netscape had roughly 62% to Internet Explorer's 35% of the browser market. By 98, IE had 50%. By 99, it was up to 80%. The bottom line, unless something changed, neither Netscape nor its open source offshoot Mozilla was in any position to challenge Microsoft in the browser market. In only a few short decades, we've seen the relationships between these titans ebb and flow. Just another reason why Netscape's Mozilla deserves a chiseled out spot in the Rushmore of the most important software in human history. But with these massive moves, what concerned those vying to compete with the monolithic Internet Explorer and the United States Justice Department was the idea of something being set as default, as in all Microsoft machines ran Internet Explorer unless you went out of your way to install and swap to a different browser. Not only does this necessitate the background info that there are choices, but it also requires the motivation to do so, something that exponentially becomes less likely as you start to use whatever browser was pre-installed day by day. And if all this talk about monopolies sounds all too familiar, it's because the exact same conversation is kind of being had today with Apple and Google in the context of their pre-installed browsers and app stores and search engines. Speaking of Apple, it's precisely in the middle of this Microsoft monopoly that they decided to fight fire with fire, introducing Safari, the new default for Apple machines revealed in 2003.
What is this? It's a totally new application. It's called Safari, and it is a turbo browser for Mac OS X.
And with it, the lifespan of Internet Explorer for Mac became drastically shortened, until inevitably the cost of maintaining it became so pointless that Microsoft discontinued it entirely 2 short years later. Although, in the beginning, Safari was introduced on the Mac as a way for Apple to break its dependence on Internet Explorer, that was only 4 years before the introduction of the iPhone and the radical shift, or frankly, the invention of the modern mobile web, and not the stripped-down, hilariously underpowered layouts of yesteryear. Safari wasn't just the Apple-designed, installed-by-default way to browse the internet on a Mac. It started to push for new features to compete in the evolving world of, as Steve Jobs would describe it when he went to the iOS keynote, internet communicators, from RSS feeds to tabs to increasing levels of ad blocking and privacy protections. Safari, according to Jobs, has reinvigorated the browser market with innovative features that deliver the best browsing experience on any platform. But, of course he would say that. And at that time, yet again, Google Search was built in, just as it would be on the iPhone, which also conveniently had its own built-in Google Maps and YouTube apps for, surprisingly, 5 solid years, from 2007 to 2012. Which brings us back to another war part of the browser wars. As the lens refocused from Apple and Mozilla to Google and Apple, the tricks and tirades got even more vocal. It got to something of a boiling point in 2005 when Google's Sergey Brin received a call from Steve Jobs, who was, according to Brin, very agitated. He was sure we were building a browser and were trying to get the Safari team. He made various veiled threats too, though I'm not inclined to hold them against him too much. Anyhow, I told him we were not building a browser. He seemed soothed. 4 days later, and Bill Campbell, famous Silicon Valley coach and board director for Apple, responded to Brin, "Steve just called me again and is pissed that we are still recruiting his browser guy. You should give him a call." From Campbell, these words had even more impact, as he was seriously involved with some of the most successful teams in Silicon Valley. So much so, following his passing in 2016, the team behind How Google Works wrote a volume on Campbell's techniques and lessons in 2019's $1 Trillion Coach. Anyway, a couple hours later, and Brin responded with, "So, I got another irate call from Jobs today. Basically, he said, if you hire a single one of these people, that means war." So, as another browser war kept boiling, it became almost hard to count just how many we've had over the past 30-odd years. Perhaps unsurprisingly, based on the back and forth we've seen so far, but between 2008 and 2012, Apple had its own cross-platform experiment. This time it was Safari for Windows. As you could imagine, this, just like every other attempt at fighting fire with fire, didn't have a lasting impact, and beyond the rare sight of seeing Mac apps on Windows, there probably isn't much to study from its failure, which somewhat neatly brings us to our current battle of by default and by choice. In 2014, Chrome would try some of those same old techniques from the 90s, locking in users with both proprietary services and with by-default software. The company is using a move straight out of the Microsoft playbook from the 1990s, using its dominant free services, Google Search, Gmail, and YouTube in particular, to push the Chrome browser, and adding capabilities that require Chrome apps, which are designed to create the same type of lock-in that Microsoft's ActiveX enforced in the early days of the web, minus the horrible security flaws. As remarked in this article outright, if that screenshot reminds you of best viewed in Internet Explorer 6, you're not alone. As similarly lamented years earlier in this article from 2010, remember the bad old days of the internet when it wasn't a given that one primary objective of any website should be to work equally well in any modern browser? Today, however, I've been getting a queasy feeling of deja vu as I explore a bunch of websites that display messages such as this. Or, as put more plainly in this Reddit thread from 2018, Google Chrome is the new IE6. Things got quite a bit more complicated when in 2011 Google introduced a radical new by default archetype, the Chromebook, a computer which doesn't really run on a traditional operating system at all. Rather, it uses Chrome as its browser and its OS. Google Chrome OS, the software itself, was announced 9 months after Google Chrome, in 2009, less than 2 years before the Chromebook. At the same time, in 2009, Chrome had already accumulated over 30 million regular users, and Google was dead set on the goal. Computers need to get better, because bottom line, the operating systems that browsers run on were designed in an era where there was no web. The solution, throw out the rest and keep the good stuff, or the Google stuff. The cherry on top, flinging a pie in the face of Apple. As the feisty battle continued, Google used one of the most popular phrases heard in Apple's announcement keynotes, albeit with a cautious qualifier from "it just works" to "it should just work." In 2017, 6 years after the launch of the Chromebook, Google's spot at the top, particularly worldwide, made it all too easy to declare Google won the browser wars. But thankfully, they haven't won the web. Perhaps in agreement with Google's sentiment that operating systems were developed in a time before the web browser, now one could posit that web browsers were developed before the current generation of the internet itself. Metaphorically, Google makes the best horses in the world, and they clearly won the horse race. I just don't think that race matters much going forward. Although, as controversial as always, 10 years after the Chromebook launched, it would overtake the Mac in market share. Our story is far from over though, because as the 2010s continued, rumblings of new ground-up browsers became louder and louder. One of the longest bastions of browser tech, usually decried as the worst of the bunch still hanging on, was about to be replaced. Rumored in 2014 and confirmed in 2015, Internet Explorer was to be superseded by Microsoft Edge. Released alongside Windows 10 and the Xbox One, Edge was originally engineered with its own rendering engine instead of Apple's WebKit or Chrome's Blink. Edge HTML, forked from Internet Explorer's MS HTML, was to be the new standard. Arguably another case of the by default curse, Edge would grow to become, as we mentioned in the earlier statistics section, one of the, well, I guess big four, or however you want to group all the superpowers in today's browser campaign. The goal this time around, according to Microsoft, was interoperability with the modern web, as in to be designed to work with the way the web is written today. But the Edge of today is not the Edge of the mid-2010s. Right before the close of the decade, Microsoft relaunched Edge as a Chromium-based browser. When that new engine in place, shipping Edge cross-platform became significantly easier, and development in general seems to have sped up remarkably fast. This new Edge was first proposed by CEO Satya Nadella in 2017, and by 2018 it was announced to the public. By April 2019, Edge launched on Windows, and a month later it was being previewed on the Mac, nearly 15 years after its Internet Explorer for Mac effort was shut down in that aftermath of Safari. And remember, in 2014, when Chrome was really stoking the flames of by default, when that article pointed out the unpleasant similarity, if that screenshot reminds you of best viewed in Internet Explorer 6, you're not alone. Well, in that same article, we can get a preview of an entirely different 2014 controversy, one that's deeply connected to the entire history of web browsers, the past, the present, and future. No, I'm not talking about how in March of that year, Firefox decided to abandon its, get this, touch-compatible Microsoft Windows 8 Metro interface, that same ill-conceived UX that was supposed to revolutionize the cross-platform world, one of the lasting memories, the Windows Phone, something we can now only reminisce about. What could have been in today's hindsight of the impossibly successful Nintendo Switch and the influential Marcus Sector-making Steam Deck, both of which, kind of capitalized on the unrealized dreams of the Metro UI. No, the real controversy in 2014, the less than 2 weeks it took for Mozilla co-founder Brandon Ike to be promoted to and then subsequently forced to step down as CEO, as 3 Mozilla board members resigned resigned in disgrace and staunch opposition to his political ideologies. You might be asking, what ideologies? Well, primarily his 2008 donation to a political campaign supporting Proposition 8, which sought to ban same-sex marriage in California. Once that came to light, Ike was blasted across social media, with sites like OkCupid even redirected users visiting the site via Firefox to a pointed letter calling for Ike's resignation. And why does Brandon Ike matter? Because this moment of ethical wrongdoing is sandwiched between his insanely big contributions to the past and the future of web browsers. In '95, Ike joined Netscape. Yes, that Netscape. After working at Silicon Graphics, yes, that Silicon Graphics, for 7 years on lower-level coding tasks like network monitoring and operating systems. So when he had to crunch to build a client-side scripting language for the upcoming Netscape beta release, he drew from his expertise to develop the first version of JavaScript in just 10 days, mixing and matching elements from C, Smalltalk, Lisp, and Java, its namesake. JavaScript today is still the fundamental browser language. It's the way that things become interactive, the way to make a website more than a static page. In fairness, HTML, the bare-bones structure of the website, and CSS, the styling, have also come a long way. And sometimes JavaScript doesn't quite feel as necessary, but it's still usually the glue that binds everything together, and the building blocks of the most popular web technologies, like Facebook's formidable framework, React. But you might be wondering, JavaScript? Wouldn't Sun, the company behind Java, that just keeps coming up in this video, wouldn't they be upset about using the name Java, especially for a project that really had nothing much to do with Java at all? No, of course not, because Netscape publicly announced and released JavaScript in a joint arrangement with Sun. Even more entangled, Ike was specifically instructed to make his browser language, which at first was called LiveScript, he was instructed to make it look like Java. Then, to make matters even more confusing, it was Netscape that, at the last possible moment, changed the name of the scripting language to JavaScript. Purely, get this, for marketing reasons. I mean, Java must have just been so hot right now. By 1998, Ike co-founded the Mozilla Project. In 2003, when AOL shut down Netscape, he helped organize the Mozilla Foundation as a separate entity. Over 10 years, in 2014, his short-lived tenure as CEO graced headlines, and he went into stealth mode on a new mystery startup. By 2015, he had reportedly raised $2.5 million in venture capital. By 2016, publicly launched his latest endeavor, Brave, a browser passionately intertwined with cryptocurrency. And by just using the Brave browser, you generate BAT tokens that can be exchanged for USD without ever even leaving the app. How exactly? Simply, it aggressively strips out ads from websites and replaces them with the ads that pay you, and then gently asks for you to divide the earnings between you and the content creators and sites you like in the form of tips. Obviously, this is still a subject of justified scrutiny. Perhaps Ike decided to just lean into criticism and make a whole company that, from the ground up, profited from a gray area. Plus, fundamentally, Brave is yet another spin on the ever-present Chromium engine. So it's damn fast, and it's dead set on cutting down the most ads and trackers it can, and it cleverly generates pennies for its users every day they surf. Speed, privacy, and pay. It's not hard to see why Brave has nudged its way into the discourse and remains to be decently popular. As reported in 2019, when Brave officially launched from public beta to 1.0, it already had 8.7 million active users and 3 million daily active users. And even if that's minuscule compared to Chrome's 1 billion active and Firefox's 250 million active, it's still something. Also in 2015, we saw the initial release of Vivaldi, founded by John Tetzschner after the opera community had shut down the virtual community website My Opera in March 2014. Vivaldi prides itself on community involvement and quickly became a pleasant collection of useful applets and products. Although it's not completely open source, in 2021 it replaced Firefox as the default browser on some strains of Linux and even became the first Android automotive compatible browser. In my experience, although sometimes it's hard to justify using Vivaldi over its vastly more popular alternatives, it's remarkably fast and reliable. And just like our next topic, it contains multitudes. I highly recommend checking it out if you're looking for a change. Finally, our last browser of the day, the newcomer and yet another Chromium-based underdog, Arc. Released in April 2022, the veritable wonderkind of the Mac browser world went cross-platform only this year, in April, almost 2 years on the dot after its initial public launch. Arc, which markets itself as the operating system for the web, a phrase and perspective that's all too familiar to our various subjects in this video, especially the Chrome team, is driven more like a shiny, feature-packed app rather than a stable, rarely changed browser, whereas Safari sticks to mostly yearly releases, which coincide with macOS's major updates, and usually these are more visual changes than anything else, and Chrome rarely adds user-centric features, which is probably why the recent introduction of AI components like Circle to Search feels so exciting. Arc front-loads updates weekly. Comparable mostly to Vivaldi, who also tries to squeeze in as many features as possible and also, coincidentally enough, uses a sidebar-first layout, Arc keeps pumping away, showcasing ideas that are usually found in extensions for other browsers, making them first-party initiatives like Spaces. Much like Firefox containers or Safari profiles, it separates out tabs, cookies, and personal information, so it's like you're running separate instances of the browser. Or easels for collaborative note-taking and sharing, kind of like Notion, Figma, Apple's Freeform, or Slack's Canvases. To boosts, to customize or inject custom styles and code into websites, much like GreaseMonkey, TamperMonkey, or Stylish. I myself used Arc for at least a year as my main driver until in February 24 they made a big deal about their new AI features, publicized in a new format for their announcements, a YouTube premiere. Although this rubbed me the wrong way, along with the general uncertainty with the future of running an investor-backed startup that's sole purpose is to ship a free web browser, it seems to have been generally well received, and it was followed up with an AI summarizer feature that I've seen used pretty broadly, especially as a new format for sharing things on social media. It's even how I found out about the arrest of Telegram's founder just a couple weeks ago through this post on Threads. Which, matter of fact, brings us full circle, back to where this all started. Threads in the present day. So, what web browser do you use, and would you ever consider switching, either to the big two, the outlier, the underdogs, or the newcomers? Leave all that and any fun stories you may have from the annals of browser history down below, and thanks for coming along with me on this time-traveling ride. And until next time, cheers.